Okay, I think we can start. So welcome. So I'm very happy to have today Professor Stefano Zacchiroli from Télécom Paris. So Stefano has been involved in open source for like many years as a Debian developer, Debian project leader, and is also CTO of Software Heritage. So today he will present best practices for source code preservation.
So thanks, Giacomo, for the invitation. Thanks, everyone, for being here. A couple of words about myself to get started. So I'm indeed the true split kind of personality here. So I'm an academic on one side. So I'm a professor of computer science at the Télécom Paris of the Polytechnic Institute of Paris. My research is mostly in the field of software engineering, open source software, and the security of the now open source supply chain. As an activist, I've been working in open source for like 25 years now. I've been Debian developer for a very long time. I've been Debian project leader. I've been on the board of the Open Source Initiative, which is the international body that determines which licenses can be called open source. And most recently, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about for the most part of today, I founded this project called Software Heritage, which is a project that aims to archive the entire body of source code that we can find for future generations. Feel free to interrupt me anytime during the lecture. I'm trying to leave some time at the end for questions, but if you have something pressing you really want to ask, do not hesitate. So first, a couple of generalities on why we're doing what we do at Software Heritage. So we live more and more in, let's say, software-dense society. So a lot of our activities as citizens, as people that used to be mediated by non-computer technology are now mediated by computer technology. So a lot of your interaction with your peers, with the state, with other people in society happens via software. So think about sending messages, thinking about driving your car, think about medical devices that you need to live a good life are all mediated by software. So that's my first observation. So essentially, there is more and more software in society, and more our lives are impacted by the presence of that software in society. I believe this room, everyone knows what open source and free software is about, so I'm not going through the historical definition of that, but essentially it's software for which you have the source code available, and you can study that software, modify it, and make a copy of that software in either binary or source code form. And what's interesting and important for us today is that even specifically about open source software, there is more and more of it in the society every minute. So there are a bunch of interesting studies showing that essentially any IT product on the market, any product that contains some software, contains at least a little bit of open source software in it. Doesn't mean the entire product is itself open. In the most cases, that's not the case, but it means it reuses at least some lines of open source software. And that's a good thing, right? Because there is more software that exists in society that we can study and look into what it does. So a notion which is very important and very motivating for me is that of the commons. Okay? So commons is a notion that has been studied by economists for a few decades now, and you usually hear it applied to natural goods. So the commons, before getting into the digital part of it, is the cultural, natural resources which exist in the world, okay, which are accessible to all members of society, and essentially with very little restriction, and those are resources which are held in common. So they do not belong to someone, they cannot be appropriated by someone, and they are essentially shared goods that all members of society can benefit from. Classical examples are air, drinking water, water used for agriculture. That is all part of natural resources that are commons. So for what matters for me and for us today is that there is also this notion that we can apply to digital goods. So there is a bunch of studies about digital commons, and specifically there is this notion of the software commons. So the software commons is essentially all computer software which is available at little or no cost, and which can be altered and reused with very few restrictions. So if you look at this definition, and you think about what you know of free and open source software, there is, of course, a striking resemblance of the two. So essentially, everything which is released publicly and it is available under an open source license, it's part of the software commons. It's not all of it, there can be other parts of it, but essentially every time a developer puts out a line of code under an open source license out there, it's increasing the amount of the software commons that exist in the world. So if you take this together with the fact that there is more and more open source software in IT products on the market, it means the size of the software commons is growing by the day. And this, again, it's a good thing, okay? So second reflection on software. Software is, in fact, a form of knowledge which is dual form. So it's not dual form in the military sense, okay? It means that it has two different purposes. So most people think of software as something that you essentially install on a machine to make that machine do something practical for you. Sending a message, giving you some leisure time by playing a game, controlling your car. So most of the people think of software as an utilitarian thing, something that you write and you run to actually control a machine. And if you want, this is the view of a machine, right? Just binary instruction that is fed to a processor to make the machine do something for you. But there's another part of software, which is the source code, which is something which is meant for humans. Okay? Source code is actually meant for humans. It's the way that developers use to tell the machine what it should do, but it's meant to be consumed also by humans. There is essentially this very nice view that says that even if you don't run a piece of software, if you have access to its source code, you can read it, and you can, provided you are skilled in software development, or you have access to someone who is skilled in software development, you can understand what it does. This is, of course, the trivial example of a piece of code that just prints strings on the screen when you run it. And even if you don't run it, you can understand something out of it. You can see that there is a command called printf. You can understand that it's probably meant to print something on the screen. So keep this thing in mind. Machines just run software to do something, but humans can look at source code of software and understand what it does, even if they don't actually run it. And my point here is that there is also scientific value in source code. So if you take the body of software that exists, if you take the software commons, it's essentially a huge body of knowledge that society has built over time, and it contains precious information, which is precious even if you never run that piece of code. So I have two examples here. So you have an example here on the left, which is from the Apollo 11 source code. It is literally the piece of code that put men on the moon. Okay, it actually was a project led by a woman that invented the notion of software engineering in the first place, by the way, Margaret Hamilton. And here on the left, you have a piece of code from the Quake 3 video game. So the piece of source code on the left, it has scientific value in the sense that it tells the story of how human beings get to walk on the moon. And nobody is going to run that piece of code anymore, unless on emulators of a very specific computer that was the AGC, the Apollo guidance computer. But you can look at it and learn something from it. For instance, you will find in that piece of code information about what we call today defensive programming. So the idea that software should be written in a way that anticipates unknown situations that weren't supposed to happen, but they can happen. And if they happen, they can put your software or your project at a significant danger. And on the other hand, on the right here, you have a piece of code from Quake 3, a video game. I don't know how many in the room are old enough to have played it. But essentially, that's a routine that shows how to compute the reverse square root not using floating point numbers. Okay, that was a very efficient way of computing the reverse square root at the time, which was novel. Okay, and essentially, this piece of source code contained valuable research information, could be as valuable as a scientific paper published in a computer graphics conference. Okay, so this piece of code here, even if you don't play Quake 3 anymore, even if you have never played Quake 3 in your life, contains information about how you can do something smart that was novel at the time. And you just need to have the source code to have that information. You don't need the other form of code, which is binary code. Okay? So let's say where we are here. So I'm making the point that software commons exist. It's a body of human knowledge, which is precious information for society. Okay? And it grows and it increases in size any single time a developer publish a new piece of code under an open source license. So, but where is this commons? So practically, this code today is distributed from platforms for the most part. You have many different platforms. You've probably heard of GitHub, which is the most popular platform for collaborative software today. But there are a bunch of different platforms. You have alternative platforms like GitLab that you can self-deploy. You have distributions that package together pieces of software called packages and distribute them to users. You have package manager repository. So they are all different platforms, for the most part operated by for-profit companies around the world, and they are the actors that are practically distributing source code to people who actually use source code to run their project, to develop, or to deploy stuff in production. And these platforms are actually fragile. So we used to think that digital information, due to the fact that you can copy it, is more robust than information that is non-digital. But that's actually not true. Precisely because digital information is ephemeral, it's actually pretty easy to remove it, to delete it, or to corrupt it in some ways. And if you didn't make copies of it before the corruption of the deletion, that information is at risk of being lost forever. And we have plenty of examples of that. Okay? So maybe you lose a link to where the piece of source code you need is distributed from. Maybe the maintainer, the person who has access to that repository, decides to remove it from the platform. Maybe decide to alter its history, deleting the track of what happened in the past. Or maybe, as it has happened in the past, the company operating the platform decide to shut it down. That has happened already multiple times. For instance, the Gitorious platform, that used to be a GitHub alternative based entirely on open source software, was bought by GitLab, a competitor to GitHub, and GitLab decided to shut the platform down. Google Code used to be a collaborative software development platform by Google that tried to see if that market was profitable for them. At some point, they decided it was not worth it. They didn't have a business case for keeping operating Google Code, and they decided to shut the platform down, which is entirely appropriate. It's a company. They should do what is best for the company. But if people only add code on that platform, well, at some point, they are at risk of losing access to the code they distributed via that platform forever. It has happened more recently with Mercurial repository on Bitbucket, so it can happen, it has happened, and it will happen again in the future. So essentially, the question here is, you have other archival platforms for stuff like websites. For instance, if a website disappears, you usually can go to the Internet Archive to see what it looked like before its disappearance. But if a Git repository you care about disappears from GitHub or from GitLab, where do you go to actually retrieve a copy of it when you need it? So this is not something new. So we've been working on this for a few years. This need of preserving source code is being recognized by UNESCO. Here it's an activity, it's a policy meeting we ran in 2018, essentially where UNESCO is recognizing the importance of preserving source code, because essentially no one before was taking a systematic approach of trying to archive all the source code that exists in the wild. And it's essentially a growing policy need that has been discussed for a few years now. And getting to the point of open science that I'm going to make today, it's also pretty important for computer science to actually preserve all the artifacts we can preserve of the history of computer science while the founding fathers and the founding mothers of the discipline are still around. So computer science is a relatively new branch in comparison to other older branches like physics that you know something about here at CERN. And essentially, we have this chance of still having some of the major figures of the discipline that are still around, people like Donald Knuth, for instance. So essentially, the idea is that we need to preserve and try to retrieve access to all the important bits of source code that has made the history of computer science, while we can still talk to these people to make sense of these artifacts before it's too late. So essentially, there is an urgency of doing this action while we still can. Okay? What has this to do with open science? So I know you have been discussing open science in this series of lectures in the past during this week. So I'm not going to rediscuss what open science is, but essentially the policy reasons why institutions, states, and funding bodies are starting to consider open science more and more as an important thing is that it's an enabler for more and better science. So this has been very clear during the COVID crisis. So here you have a bunch of quotes. And essentially, you see this is from the National Plan for Open Science in France. And it is making the case that it's the unhindered dissemination of results, everything we produce in science, be it results published in papers, be it data, be it software, the more we make it accessible to society at large, the more we can disseminate information that is relevant for people, and the more we can enable other scientists to build upon our results to make better science and faster science in the future. This has been a very major realization moment during the COVID crisis in which essentially people have been able to share data much more quicker and much more faster than in the past, and this has enabled a larger body of science to be produced in a short amount of time. And software, it's actually a key part of all sciences. Software is not only something which is relevant for computer science, obviously, but it's also not relevant only for, let's say, more technical disciplines. There's been a very interesting study a few years back on Nature studying the top 100 papers in essentially all fields, all science fields across the board, and so showing that essentially in all fields of science, you have some part of software that matters. Okay? So the importance of software is not only specific to tech people, it's something that all scientists use in all disciplines. Okay? And if you want to think at what are the artifacts that matter in open science, so we have this view that essentially there is a trifecta of artifacts that are produced by science, and we need to preserve and make them openly accessible, all three of them. So you have papers, which has historically been the main output of researchers. And the open science take on papers is that those papers should be made available open access, so everyone can read them, scientists and citizens alike. Then you have data sets. So more and more science is empirical science, and we produce and we study data produced by others. So data should be made available, open data, to citizens and to other scientists. And that is needed both for building on top of the result of other scientists and to review the result that has been published by others in the past. And then the third part that remains here is open source software. So more and more science is supported by existing pieces of open source software. And more science is accompanied by software which is produced as part of doing science. And the open science take on the software which is used for experiment is that that software should be made available under an open source under an open source license and released publicly so that, again, citizens can review science, can check the results, and other scientists can build upon the software developed by their peers. So you essentially need these three parts to support open science properly in all science fields, and you need to preserve these links here. So it should be possible when you read a paper that is available open access, if that paper talks about some open data set, you need to be able to link the paper to the data set. And if that paper talks about some piece of software used or produced as part of that experiment, you should be able to link to that piece of software and retrieve it. Okay? And note one important thing here. Software in science, again, has at least two roles. One is that it's a dependency. So you need software to run your experiments. Okay? And the other is that it can be a product of your research. So more and more scientists produce software themselves, and so this software is the output of their work. And in some cases, specifically in my field, that of empirical software engineering, software can also be a research object. So people in software engineering study software produced by others, scientists or not, and essentially software there becomes the object of their study. So we need to make sure that our workflows and our tools for supporting access to open source software in open science supports all these three use cases. Okay? And last point here, if your experiment needs software to be run, which as we know now, it's more and more the case in all disciplines of science, if you want to check the reproducibility of your experiment, you need access to the source code to be able to rerun your experiment. That's a requirement. It's not a sufficient condition because reproducibility is much more complicated. So you might have access to all the source code of an experiment and still fail to reproduce it. But if you don't have access to the source code of an experiment, well, actually you miss a requirement for actually being able to rerun the experiment in the future. Okay, so what can we do for avoiding the risk that essentially we lose access to source code that is important for either society or for science in general? So this is the reason why it was back in 2015, we decided to create this project called Software Heritage, whose goal is to collect all the source code we can find, preserve it in the long run, so making sure we don't lose anything that we have collected, and giving it access, sharing what we have archived to anyone who needs it. Be it the random developer, be it someone in society who wants to access some code, or some scientist that need it to replicate past experiments. So it's a project that was meant to serve 3 different use cases. I'm going to focus only on one today, but I'm going to present all 3 of them briefly now. So the first one is preservation. So the idea is that there is valuable information for society in source code that has costed a lot of brain time from people to build. We don't want to risk to lose access to it due to some decision of platforms shutting down. So that's the universal archive use case. So the project's been funded by INRA in France in collaboration with UNESCO that recognized the importance of preserving source code. And so this was the initial focus. But then we realized that there are 2 other use cases that comes naturally with this project. So one is that once you have collected all the source code that exists out there, what you can provide is a reference catalog. Essentially, you can provide an identifier for all pieces of code that are used anywhere, okay, all pieces of publicly available code that are used anywhere, and provide a catalog where they are indexed, they are searchable, and they can be referenced for saying, hey, this IT device that you're using contains all these pieces of open source software that are available in that archive. And then you have a use case, which is the one we're going to focus on today, which is a research infrastructure. So a place where scientists can deposit their code and reference them from their papers, from their other research artifacts, and also for people in my field, a place where scientists can do analysis on all the source code that has been archived in the archive. This is something that exists today. Okay, so if you go to archive.softwareheritage.org, I'm going to show you an example later, but if you can already visit it now if you want to, you will find statistics about what we have archived, and we are already today the largest public archive of source code that exists in the world. So these numbers, I think, so this date back to, I think it's up to date up to January 2023, so it has grown since. But we have archived more than 200 million projects, okay? To approximate, let's see that a project here is a version control system repository like a Git repository. So we have archived more than 200 million repositories for more than, now I think we have passed the 15 billion unique source code files, and more than, now we've passed the 3 billion commits. So 3 billion different versions of software. Okay, and the idea is to build a single thing, so just the archival part, to serve different needs for cultural heritage, for industry, for research, and also for public administration. So we have some basic principles on which the project is built. So it's all open source software. So our own implementation of the archive is entirely open source software. It's all replicated in multiple copies, both copies that we operate ourselves and mirrors, which are operated by others. It's run as a completely non-profit initiative, so it's not a startup, it's not a company, it's a fully non-profit initiative with several stakeholders. Some of them are public, some of them are private funders that are just sponsors of the project. And everything that is stored in there actually uses intrinsic identifiers, which I'm going to present next, to making sure that everything that is archived can be verified downstream for integrity with respect to the initial copy. I'm not going to detail a lot of the technical stuff, but I have some support material if you want to discuss it later. So the general idea is that we are a crawler, and we crawl public places which are used typically to develop or distribute software in a collaborative manner. So we crawl places like GitHub. We have a full copy of the entire public GitHub. We crawl places like multiple instances of GitLabs, but also package manager repositories, things like PyPy or NPM or crates.io. We crawl those places. And for all of those places, we essentially list all the points of software distribution we can find. For instance, when we crawl GitHub, we list all the public repository that exists there. When we crawl something like PyPy, we list all the Python packages that we find there. And periodically, so this is the listing part, and periodically we visit all those places and we load into a single archive all the source code artifacts that we find there. And source code artifacts are not just files or directories. They are all the versioning information that we find in a given version control system or in a given package repositories. So for instance, when we crawl a Git repository, we do not just archive the most recent version there. We go back in time, we crawl all the commits that we find in there. For each commit, we store all the metadata associated to them, the author, the commit message, the signatures, the timestamp, all this information. And for each commit, we store all the versions of all the files we find in the archive itself. Okay? Then we store also stuff like the status of the repository of the time of the archival, so that we can always reconstruct the exact state of the repository at the time of archival. So if the repository disappears, we still have the old versions. And even if the author changes the story of the repository retroactively, we can still reconstruct the old version of the repository that we have archived in the past. The data model, it's what we call it's a Merkle structure. So essentially, it's a gigantic graph in which each node has an intrinsic identifier, which is computed using a cryptographic checksum. So every single file is identified by a cryptographic checksum, so that when you retrieve the file later, you can verify that it corresponds to the version that was available somewhere else in the past. And that goes up to the graph for all different types of nodes. So a directory is associated to a cryptographic checksum of all its content. A commit is associated to a cryptographic checksum of all its metadata and all the directories and files it references, and so forth up to the full state of a repository. So if you knew, for instance, the last commit identifier of a Git repository before it disappeared, you can retrieve that repository from our archive and verify that the checksums match. Okay? So up to the cryptographic guarantees offered by checksum, you have this very strong integrity verification. And the resulting thing is that this is essentially as if it were a gigantic version control system, a single one, of all the code we have archived from essentially all the public places we've found on the internet. Okay? It's a pretty big graph, so the size is roughly 30 billion nodes and 300 billion edges, so it's not as big as the graph of the web, but we are not that many order of magnitudes away from it. And in terms of size, it's big, but it's not that big. So obviously, the size is taken mostly by the content of the files themselves, and it's about 1 petabyte of data. Okay? What's interesting here is, due to this choice of using cryptographic identifiers from the node for all nodes, this data model automatically deduplicates everything. So if we find a file in 10 million different repositories, it's stored only once. If we find a commit in hundreds of thousands of repositories, which can be the case for commits that exist in very popular projects like the Linux kernel, that has hundreds of thousands of forks on GitHub, well, every single commit and all its references is stored only once. If 50 years from now, developers of the world migrate from GitHub to the next new thing, okay, we will not have to store all the data again. We will just update the information that this new repository that we have never seen in the past well, happens to point to the same thing that we had already archived 50 years ago from GitHub. Okay? That's a general idea. So I have some technical details on the identifiers. So I'm just going to be quick here in the interest of time. So our identifiers are called SWIDs, the Software Heritage Identifiers, which are a standard that is seeing quite a bit of adoption. It is used in the standard like SPDX for representing software bill of materials. It is used on Wikidata to point to repository states. We are now in the process of making it an ISO standard. And the idea is that you have a prefix with a version number. You have a type of object. So content is for files. Then you can reference directories. You can reference revisions, which is our name for commits. You can version software releases. And you can version snapshots, which are the full state of a repository at the time of archival. What you have next is essentially a hash, in this case a SHA-1 hash, of the object itself. And depending on what you reference, you will be able to retrieve a single file, a directory, a commit, or a full state of a repository. Plus, you can add some context information, like where this object was coming from, and which part of it you are interested in. Like if you want to highlight a specific line in a file, you can do that. Or if you want to highlight a specific path within a directory, you can do that as well. I'm going to come back with some demo and live example later. Okay, so let's get now to the role of source code in open science. So there's in fact a bunch of different needs related to source code in open science. So researchers, like me, needs to do stuff like archive software artifacts associated to a paper, for instance, and reference which specific artifacts I've used in a paper. The classic example is I create what is called a replication package for an experiment, an empirical experiment on software that I did. I want to associate the replication package to the paper in a solid way. I want to be able to find useful software. I want to be able to get credit for software that as a researcher I've developed. And I want to be able to reproduce results published by other scientists, other researchers, in some papers I'm reading. So these are the needs from the point of view of researchers. Then you have the needs of laboratories and teams. Probably you have something similar here at CERN. So laboratories usually want to be able to track the contributors that are members of the team when they contribute to other repositories. And they want to produce reports saying, hey, look how cool we are producing all this software, and maintain automatically some web page with all that information. And then you have larger organizations and funders, which want essentially to be able to know their software assets, the software they are using internally, and the software they're producing for doing stuff like technology transfer, being able to know how many people are using my software in the world, impact metrics, and you want essentially to be able to do some sort of career evaluation of the people working for you or the people you are funding based on the impact of the software they're producing. So let's start with so these are the needs that we are calling ARDC, okay? And they are kind of subtle and different from the general idea of only being able to cite software. So first of all, we want to be able to archive software artifacts, okay? And when we want to archive software artifacts, we want to make sure we can retrieve what we have archived, which seems obvious, but it's actually not that obvious. For instance, when you get a DOI for a paper, in a DOI, you have an in-between actor that can change where the DOI points to. So if you just have a DOI to a paper, you don't have a guarantee that tomorrow, when you retrieve it, you will retrieve exactly the same thing you have deposited today. It is generally the case, but it's not enforced by the way DOI identifier works. So we want to be able to archive software and retrieve it later. We want to be able to reference exactly the kind of artifacts we need and verify its integrity later on. We want to be able to describe piece of research software, okay? So what is behind these artifacts, okay? And we want to be able to cite software produced by a researcher. And this is not the same thing as referencing software, because when you reference something, it's usually an artifact that you want to be able to retrieve later and verify its integrity. When you cite some software, like in a citation of a paper, it's actually for giving credit to the authors, and you're not giving credit or citation to a specific artifacts. You're giving credit to a more abstract notion, which is the notion of a software product, which is something that changes over time, but still maintains its identity. So let's see how we can support all these needs in practice with software heritage. So there were some old ways of doing archival, okay? So you can point to a FTP server, you can point to a web page, okay? This is like a web page where each researcher has a web page saying, hey, this is software I maintain. Or you can do something more modern, okay? Like this is kind of the state of the art of referencing software in papers today. So often people just reference from their paper the repository where they have archived, they think they have archived, where they put some software. So there are a bunch of papers saying, I've used this software, here is the GitHub URL of this project. Or I've published this software, or I published this replication package, and they give you a URL of the forge where they published the thing. That can happen in some cases on some institutional project. Okay, can be this, what is the example here? So I don't have the highlight. So it can be something like, this is on the INRIA GitLab, okay? This is an institutional forge that INRIA, a public research institution in France, has created, and they encourage their researcher to publish software on this platform. Or you can use some more generic platform, like just pointing to GitHub. So you have your paper, and you have a URL pointing to GitHub. Or you can have a mix of the two. This is an example of a paper. So it's a paper, so I'm suppressing the specific here, but this is a paper in the ACM Digital Library, which has received these fancy badges that says that someone has verified that the artifacts associated with this paper are available, and they've even verified that they actually work. So someone has verified that the artifacts described in this paper, a piece of software, works and they are properly documented. Except that if you look into what the artifacts are here, you see it's like a 3.5 kilobyte artifacts. That's not very big. Okay, it can contain some pseudocode, but for sure it's not a full piece of source code for a modern project. And in fact, the artifact that they have deposited here is just a single README file saying the code is on that GitHub repository, which is also referenced from here. Okay? So this is something we can improve upon, because there is no guarantee at all that this artifact here associated to this paper will be available even 2 weeks from now. Everything can happen. The author of the repository can shut it down. GitHub at some point can shut it down in the future, so there is no guarantee of preservation here. And even if you have a fancy DOI, that's not going to help you much in the future. If you're lucky, that DOI is going to get you to this README file, and that's it. Okay? So let's see how we can make something better out of it. So important point here to retain and to communicate to your colleagues, forges are not archived. Okay? GitHub can disappear. The GitLab of your institution can disappear. The home page of the postdoc that was here for 1 year can disappear. It will disappear. The home page of the intern probably doesn't even exist at the time it gives you a URL. Okay? So don't trust forges as archives. So if the only way you're linking your paper to some software or some data for what it's worth is a forged URL, well, you're doing it wrong. So quick tour is how we can do things differently with using software heritage. So I don't have highlights. If I do this, do I have highlights? Yes, much better. Okay, so as a user, you can browse the archive. Okay, so this is just a common search bar in which you can search for a project. I don't know if I have some interesting example here. What's GNU GCC Git? So you can search for a project. Is the network working? Yes. So you can search for a project here. You will find some URL of project we have archived in the past. So this is, for instance, the Git repository of GNU. You will see when we have archived it. You have a common visit interface where we can see essentially the calendar of when we have archived stuff. This is not a very interesting one. Let me try something else. ParMap, is that one? And some interesting example of. Yes, so I wanted the one by Roberto. This is a parallel, a library for parallel programming in functional programming language or Camel. So you will see here when we have archived it. The last time we have archived it was a few days ago. And you can look at the calendar. Whoops, why is this working? I'm not sure why this is not working, but here you can essentially... Okay, that's a demo effect. Sorry about that. But essentially, for each visit, here we are navigating the 24 March one. You can navigate the code pretty much as you do in on any forge, but except this time you are navigating the archived version and not the live version. Okay. And the example I've shown you before, so this is the Apollo 11 excerpt shown you before. You can see here that this points to a specific file in that project with highlight of the same piece of code I've shown you in the slide before. So you can reference source code, okay, using the suite. So when you are in a specific directory you want to reference, you have here on the right permalinks. Essentially, you can decide what you want to reference. Do you want to reference this directory of source code? Will get you a permalink, which is a directory identifier. You can reference this specific revision, okay, the commit, or you can reference the entire state of the repository, and it will give you different things. And you can add contextual information by saying, hey, okay, here I'm referencing this archive, this piece of software, this state of a repository, and I'm adding contextual information of where it comes from. And both of them are interesting because the first one will give you a way to download a piece of code from Software Heritage, okay, and retrieve it. And the other one will give you information of where you could go if you want to find if the project still exists today and if there are newer versions that maybe have not been archived yet. So when you are on a project, here you can ask to download it, okay. By default, it will give you a directory. And when you have downloaded it, you have some command line tool. So this is something I've done it yesterday. Yes, something I've done it yesterday. So you have here, this is a directory of a project I've downloaded yesterday. And we have a tool called SWH Identify that you can use, of course it's all free software, to compute on the fly the checksum of something you have downloaded. And here you can say that, you can see here that this is the directory I've downloaded from Software Heritage, okay? You can compute on the fly the identifier implementing the same standard, which are suites, and you see that the checksum corresponds. So you know that from the time it was archived, or from the time you have referenced it on the UI, the time you downloaded it, it hasn't changed, okay? So it's not something that a person in the middle or a platform in the middle have modified, and you can be sure that the checksum are exactly the same. Okay. How do you get something archived yourself? Okay, so we have this service here, which is called Save Code Now. This is the web UI, but you also have an API if you want to, which essentially you can ask our crawlers to archive something that we haven't archived yet. And you see here that we support a bunch of different version control systems. So it's not only Git. Here you write the URL of the projects you want to archive, and it will be automatically archived by our crawlers. If it is on GitHub, on GitLab, or on some of the platforms that you already support, there's no need to do that. But you can actually ask the archive to archive something which is on your home page or on an institutional platform that we do not crawl yet. And you can also provide, you need to be logged in for this, but you can also request that we archive a full forge that we don't know anything about yet. So for instance, if you go on the archive page here you have a list of the platform we currently archive. If you open this up, you see all the GitLab instances that we are archiving right now. So there is the main GitLab instances, gitlab.com, plus a bunch of other GitLab instances that people have asked that we archive. And using AddForge now, you can tell us, hey, can you please archive this GitLab instance that we don't archive yet? Okay? And last but not least, when you are on a specific project, whatever, it's going to show up. So this is a specific version of the Apache HTTPD. Last time it has been archived on March 19. You can ask here, save again, to actually say, please can you prioritize the archival of this repository of mine, because I want to take an identifier right now to put it in my paper, and it will archive it on the fly. Also, we have a browser extension. Let's see, this is a project I'm working on for graph compressions. We have a browser extension here, which is called Update Software Heritage, which is available for a bunch of browsers, that will tell you either that this project is up to date, so it is green, so it means that this has been archived the last time in March, 10 of March, and this matches the state of the repository itself, because it was last changes on 24 February. We have archived it on March 3rd, so it's okay. If it's not archived, you can just click it, and it will send a request to our API to archive it on the fly. So it will show you essentially, while you browse platforms like GitHub or GitLab, whether the software heritage copy of that specific repository is already up to date or not. Okay, so time is running out. So the last thing I want to show is that we have an integration with platforms like, which one I want to show you? Journals. Yeah, so we have integration with some journals working with us. So this is, for instance, is a journal of image processing online. Apparently, it's a very large community of computer graphics that I didn't know about before we started working with them. And we are integrated with the journal so that when an author send a paper to them associated to some source code, the source code associated to the paper is automatically pushed to Software Heritage together with metadata about the publication. We send them back information about the identifier of that specific piece of source code, or source code artifacts more generally, and in the journal themselves, they actually add the linking information. So we know it's coming from them, we know the specific paper to which this was associated, and they point back to Software Heritage to see this specific version of the artifact was associated to the journal paper. This work with this journal here, it works with eLife, which is another very big journal from natural sciences in the US. And we have integration with HAL, H-A-I-L, which is essentially the ARXIV, A-R-X-I-V of National One in France, where all researchers in France, public researchers in France are supposed to deposit preprints of their papers, and we have similar integration. So researchers can deposit either source code directly to HAL or associate source code attachments to their papers, which are sent back to Software Heritage. We send them back a link, and you have the same kind of integration. I have a link for this in a second, I think. Yeah, so last thing, this was for archive and reference. And then there is the how do you get citation for papers deposited. The idea is that you can associate to your repository a file called codemeta.json. So codemeta is an ontology for describing pieces of software, which is integrated in schema.org, which is a much larger project for essentially curating ontologies for the web. And in this file, an author can provide information in a machine-readable way of how people should cite in their scientific papers their pieces of software. Okay? So this is in our repository. Okay? This is in the repository of ParMap, the project I've shown you before, and the author is in there, which is my colleague Roberto, provided all this metadata information that you can either write themselves or you have some creator for this. And starting from this, you can automatically get a citation from places like HAL. So here's an example. This is a C++ template library deposited on HAL, okay? And from there, you can automatically generate citations in a bunch of places in the formats you want. For instance, you can get a BibTeX here saying, this is how you cite this specific piece of code from the from which is doing full circle deposited software heritage and something you can cite. Last piece of the puzzle here is BibLaTeX software, which is an extension. It's a LaTeX package, an extension of BibLaTeX that you can use to reference specific software artifacts from your papers. So for the citation information, you have CodeMeta.json. For the referencing part, for referencing specific software artifact, you have BibLaTeX software. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because I want to give you chances to ask some questions. So in practice, what you can do, for archiving and referencing source code that is used in research, make sure it is archived in software heritage. You have a bunch of ways of doing that. You have the save code now, which is the easier thing you can do, or you can associate your source code to your papers when you use platforms like HAL or some of the journals who are working this. How do you obtain a specific software heritage identifier? If it is already archived in our archive, you just have the permalink box on the right to obtain your reference. And you essentially mention it in your paper for reproducibility information using stuff like BibLaTeX software. For the citation part, okay, you add a CodeMeta.json file with your repository, essentially. And you can obtain essentially the corresponding citation in the catalog where your project ended up referencing, like via HAL, in various forms, as I've shown you in the demo a few minutes ago. And policy making, so we are working on with a bunch of funders and public bodies to essentially improve the state of the art of practices, best practices for manipulating open source software related to open science. And essentially, we're pushing forward a bunch of policy actions. One is that the default for research software should be that it is openly licensed and publicly distributed. So we have achieved this in the national plans for France for open science. And in Europe, the EOSC, the open source cloud, is also working in that direction. The idea is that if you want to use research software, if you want to produce research software which is not open source by default, well, you need to justify why. You cannot just say just because. You need to make it explicit why it is not open source software. Okay, and then avoid creating specific platforms on which to archive software for reference. Try to use some of the existing one. Software heritage is one, of course, is the one that I think is most promising. But essentially, let's try to federate together on large platforms rather than creating a balkanization of small and non-interoperable platforms. Okay, that's all I have. I want to stop here so that we have chances to discuss. And I have a bunch of backup material that I will leave you in the slides so that you can learn more about the project. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for the super interesting talk. I've seen there's a question in the Zoom chat. I'm going to read it, and then we can take questions from the room. Okay, you can. I've seen there's a raised hand from the person who asked. So go on.
Hi. Yeah, I also had a second question. So I'll just start with the one in the chat. So I noticed that the CERN GitLab instance is in the software heritage, but only in 2020. Subsequently, there isn't. And if I look at the sources, like in all the different forges in GitLab, CERN GitLab is not there. Okay. So I was wondering, what could be a reason when software heritage might stop archiving a form?
You sure it was the old one was a GitLab instance and not something else?
It was GitLab. It has been GitLab for many years.
So I don't know the history specifically there, but given it is not in the list right now, I'm pretty sure it means we are not actively crawling it right now. So please submit it, and we'll start archiving it again.
Okay, so thank you. So my actual question that I wanted to ask was, so here it's basically you're taking in everything, right?
Yes,
so
everything which is accessible.
Right. So there is a lot of noise also. For example, I just looked up my own old random repositories and I could find them that I have deleted in the past, say from GitHub. So it seems like it's like a lot of overhead for having something citable. So that was my sort of part question, that okay, is this really an overhead, or is just the answer is the disk space is cheap and we don't care?
Yeah, so it's a bit in between the two. So it is overhead, of course. I would say that it's most in terms of, crawling your repository than in terms of how much space they take. But there is a trade-off there, right? So you can have an approach in which you only archive stuff that people ask you to archive. So you put the threshold for archival pretty high, okay, and you only archive that stuff. The alternative approach is saying you archive everything you can archive, because if you don't do that, you risk losing something that was important, but you discover it was important only when it is too late. So we clearly heard towards this end of the spectrum, and for now it's completely sustainable, because even if you're right that especially on platforms like GitHub there is a lot of noise, even a lot of garbage, I would say 95% of GitHub is essentially dead, so it doesn't see updates anymore. Okay, so it costs you something in the beginning when they show up to archive, but in the long run, it's actually not that bad in terms of additional overhead, as you put it.
Okay, so then a follow-up question would be, so here you then also have, like often on GitHub, I see that there are these malicious repositories, right? Like namespace squatting kind of stuff, right? Or sometimes will point from a real open source project and they'll namespace squat and add a malicious binary release. So do you think there's some kind of possibility or tools that is there that a researcher can use to do this kind of a historical study of malicious stuff?
So in this talk, I didn't actually focus on that part, but essentially my main field of research and a bunch of people working with me is actually empirical research on all this amount of data. And you're absolutely right that given we archive also, let's say, malicious stuff, like typo squatting and more, for sure it's interesting to use this data to study that phenomenon. Absolutely. It's interesting and people are doing that already.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for your questions.
Okay. Do we have other questions from Zoom? You can raise a hand, or from the room. Yes.
I see one there.
Yes. Thanks a lot for the cool presentation. You are mentioning, I'm going to ask a few questions about metadata.
Sure.
You are mentioning code meta there, but it is not the only standard that it is in the community. I can raise 2,000 questions and points, yes. Like what happens if, so basically, is Software Heritage trying to standardize or create a metadata standard that links all together? What happens, is there a way of finding the metadata associated to one of the entries in software heritage if it doesn't contain a code meta file? Or
so to be clear, we are recommending code meta here as a way to add information for making your software citable. Okay, that is for the workflow of researchers that want to make their software something you can cite. But more generally, in terms of metadata, we support essentially little by little everything we can support. So the main archive archives essentially version control systems to simplify, and the main guarantee we offer is that we can give you back a byte by byte identical copy of the repository that we have archived in the past. On top of that, we have some indexing of metadata that we find in the repository themselves. And that is not specific to code meta. For instance, we index metadata that we can extract from Debian packages, Python packages, Node packages, Rust packages. So all these package managers have standardized their metadata format, and we have out-of-band indexers that looks into what we have archived, extract this metadata, and map them into something which is searchable. Okay? But the point is, as you point out, there are thousands of metadata formats, so to make them searchable, we had to decide which ontology to map them to. And at the time we looked into that, code meta was the most promising for mapping software-related information. So that's what we chose, but it's something that potentially it could be changed in the future, because that's, we can always re-index and rebuild this index of the metadata we have in the archive. But the important part here is that there are two separate things. So one is indexing metadata that in the stuff we have archived. There we can support everything essentially, as long as you then can do something meaningful with that. And something else is how do we tell to scientists how to add curated information about how to cite that software. And for that, code meta seemed the most promising solution right now. Does it answer your question?
More or less, yes, thank you.
Okay.
So which is the metadata standard that you guys are using in software heritage? Or is
what do you mean with using? Because we're using more of them,
yes,
right?
That's
so as the one recommended to scientists is code meta.
Yeah.
And the indexing we do, we also map stuff we can extract to some of the properties of code meta. Essentially, those that we were able to find in all the different package metadata standards, we mapped them to the equivalent in code meta if they exist.
Okay, thanks.
But it's an internal thing, right? So that part is completely internal.
There's Bernard from the chat, from Zoom.
Right. So this might tie in the previous discussion. For a couple of years, people have been telling me as an offer of software on GitHub that I should also make my repository citable. And they told me whenever we have a release, make sure we have an archive of that release on CERN's Zenodo. Mm-hmm. So we added this Zenodo JSON and we set up all the automatic hooks to create a DOI on Zenodo whenever we release. A couple years later, GitHub created this citation CFF file format that we should use. And Zenodo now supports that, so we rewrote all the metadata, and now we use citation CFF. And now I see your talk, and you advertise this code meta JSON, and now I feel like now I have to redo that again. I don't know whether Zenodo has support for this code meta JSON. So how is this? What should I do as a developer? What standard should I pick now?
Right.
Should I abandon Zenodo? Should I pick Software Heritage now? Like, what's the way forward?
So I'm not gonna pretend I can tell you what to do. Essentially what you're saying is a complicated space which is moving quite fast, and there are no clear winner yet. That's absolutely true. What I want to mention, though, is the difference between archival in Zenodo versus Software Heritage. Okay? So essentially what happened when you archive on Zenodo, which we're great partners, we're working with them, is that you take a snapshot of that specific release of software. So essentially you take a tarball of the specific commit, and that tarball goes to Zenodo, and it's archived there forever, which is great, but that doesn't give you the view of the role of that specific release in the broader spectrum of the software commons. So for instance, if you look here, I have an example. If you compare the library mentioned on Zenodo, which is archived there, what you get is a tree archive. It's essentially a tarball with a zip file, and you see what's inside there. If you look at the same on Software Heritage, you have the entire development history, okay, of this thing here. And here you can see, for instance, all the commits before those. So on Zenodo, you have created essentially a package that contains a snapshot of the repository at a specific point in time, while the equivalent archive on Software Heritage keeps the project history and can be used in the future to show you, for instance, who else has used your piece of code. So that is very different data model approach. For the citation part, you are right that there are multiple formats. So I believe you can convert meta.json to citation.cff. So I believe you have some level of conversion between the two. But hey, if that ends up winning and if it contains all the information we want to store, we can switch to that or vice versa. Okay, so it's still moving. We're trying to support what we can support in terms of technical effort. And right now, this is where we are.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I actually have a question on because you mentioned like requirements from organizations and teams to evaluate the impact, and
yes.
So I was wondering if you have plans on this, on making something more not manager friendly, but in general more suitable to.
So I have some example of that. So for instance, here I didn't have time to show you an example, but this, for instance, is for INRIA. This is an automatically generated page with all the software that we have indexed, produced by INRIA, okay, and deposited on HAL. Okay, so researchers from INRIA are encouraged to deposit to HAL. And if they deposit source code, it automatically goes to Software Heritage. And then you have all the tool chain I've shown you to generate citations and references. And from that, using HAL tool, which is something that exists associated to HAL, you can automatically generate this page. Okay? You can generate it at the level of institutions. You can generate it at the level of individuals. You can generate it at the level of labs. Okay? I'm not saying you should use that because, of course, that probably the main deposit platform for open access here is probably Zenodo, but you can essentially build the same pipeline using different solutions. And that is not manager friendly in the sense that they can set it up, but it's an integration which is totally doable. Okay? And another example I want to show you is a denom thing. What is the gov? No, this is my tax. That's not what I was looking for. Do you have a link here? Blue ads. No, sorry, I don't have the link ready. But essentially, the public catalog of open source software of the French Inter-Ministry Direction for IT has essentially done a census of all the different repositories where software developed by public administration has been published. And they reference that, and they cross-reference that with Software Heritage. So for each piece of code, you can see where it was the last time and where it was archived. Okay? And you can, in theory, also use Software Heritage to actually find those contributions and actually map them to the kind of report you want to produce. So it's part of the pipeline. It's something you can build on top of this. But if you're asking me, ready to use tool for a manager, not yet.
Okay. Now, well, maybe we'll collaborate in the future because we want to also look into this. Are there other questions? Yes.
Okay, first of all, thanks for the very interesting talk. You mentioned how hard it is to make software reproducible. Other than archiving, of course, the source code and all the history, do you have any plans on how to make software easily runnable and executable in the future?
So first of all, the context of digital preservation was more mature in terms of preservation of executable than preservation of source code when we started. Okay? So there are some solutions in the space for preserving the execution of executables and make sure they keep on running. Okay? But usually the focus there is more like on how do we keep this game, which is important for cultural reasons, runnable in the future, and you start doing stuff like virtual machines, you start piling on virtual machine to make sure you can keep it running. Scientific experiments are more difficult. So there are a bunch of studies in essentially all the disciplines I can think of that have shown how we are in a reproducibility crisis. It pains me that it's as bad as computer science as it is in other fields, because in theory, it should be easier to make a fully computer experiment reproducible than something that involves biology or people or whatnot. And there are analyses of why it is so difficult to make your experiment reproducible. The main reason usually is that you don't have a full view of all the software dependencies of your experiment. Like if you look into replication packages in my field, for instance, I see this is the code I've developed for this experiment. But then it depends on 50 Python packages. You are lucky if they mention the specific version of the Python package you depend upon. And you are lucky if dependencies are listed in a transitive manner. Okay? What you're trying to build here is something in which if you are the researcher and you depend on a gazillion dependency, at least you don't need to archive all of them. The idea is that most of your dependencies are already archived, so you find the links to them and you provide a single thing that references all of them. Okay? But the state of the art is definitely not there yet. It's getting better. So again, in my field, I see that more and more conferences actually demand now replication packages, and they're putting in, they're creating these artifact evaluation committees in which you have your paper accepted, but you get some of the badges that I've shown you before. You have an additional review step in which some technical people looks into whether you have published something and whether they are runnable. But again, runnable doesn't mean they reproduced your experiment. And it's complicated, it's really complicated. Yes. But okay, I see steps in the right direction.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah. So thanks for the talk, it was amazing. What is your view in how are code platforms extending Git in a way that it's not one, it's not in a well-described way? So, for example, GitHub is adding a bunch of features that are overlapping with Git itself. They're introducing their own command line tool. The wiki themselves are in parallel the Git repositories, and I see these going forth and forth for all of them.
So what I can say is that there is, if we take the dominant platforms, so at least GitHub and GitLab today, a lot of information that are relevant for a project are not stored in the version control system itself. The wiki, I guess, in some cases is, but not, well, GitHub Pages usually is, but the wiki actually it's not.
Yeah,
right?
by default, the Git are a parallel, the wiki are a parallel Git repository.
The issues are not in there, discussions are not in there. So what I can say is that that is making our mission harder, because if by default it would have been all in there, well, we could say we are also archiving by default all these other information which we currently are not. So of course it's a business decision of these companies to try to make it harder to migrate from one platform to another. So I don't see it changing anytime soon. But of course I would personally welcome storing all that information in a single and standardized media, which is easier to archive. I know there exist tools though. So there are tools that essentially crawl for you, if you are the owner of the project, all this information and can create for you packages that can then be migrated to other places. But there are third-party tools. And I wouldn't be too surprised that if they end up becoming popular, at some point they will be kind of stopped by the platform hosters. So that's my personal take on the matter.
Okay, I don't think we have other questions, so I wanted to thank Stefano again for an excellent talk and Q&A session, and
Thanks
for coming here.